Hi, welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. And so it begins 2 weeks of our Christmas and New Year's specials in which we look back on the year that was and peer into the future with some of our roster of amazing guests, all heterodox thinkers who wouldn't be caught dead on Raytheon Finance Corporate Media. First up, James Howard Kunstler, Stacy.
Right. James Kunstler, welcome to the Keiser Report Christmas special. You're our first guest. How do you feel?
I feel ho, 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 and it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Right. So you are the author of The Geography of Nowhere, a history of American suburbia and urban development. So let's start with the hellscape that is California. Billed as a woke utopia, what we've seen on the ground is instead fecal-ridden sidewalks and mass looting events. What went wrong?
Geez, where do you want me to start? Among other things, our simple unwillingness to actually confront truthfully the conditions on the ground that we see around us. And homelessness is obviously a biggie out in California. And I think we confuse the whole issue by calling them homeless because mainly they're drug addicts and people with mental illness who in an earlier age in America would be treated in public hospitals and taken care of. But around the 1970s, we decided that they were an oppressed political minority and that we should just, not put them in hospitals and not treat them. And that was supposedly more humane. And so you see the consequences of that. Well, the connections between the choice we made to deploy all of our American life along the highway strip and many of the distresses of our day are actually pretty clear. And, they speak to this condition of kind of group psychosis that the psychologist Matthias Desmet has been talking about on the web. It's called mass formation psychosis. And it's kind of what we're seeing now in the COVID hysteria. And really what happens is you have a society where people feel disconnected from other people. They're alienated. They don't belong to a community. That's the first condition. The second condition is that they're filled with a sense of purposelessness in their life. Their vocation means nothing to them because they're working for some giant faceless corporation doing something stupid, or maybe not even doing that. So they're purposeless. They're disconnected from community. This produces a tremendous amount of anxiety and alienation. And in order to deal with that alienation, it has to be fixed on some object. So, as this was developing, the first object that it really fixed on was Donald Trump. And, it did produce a kind of a strange, neurotic, obsessive, psychosis about him. And once they shoved him off stage, of course, the next thing it fixed on was the COVID-19 virus. And it's very hard to tell what's really going on with that behind the scenes, although it looks like it's a kind of assisted suicide of the U.S. Conducted by Dr. Fauci. And God knows what else and who else is behind it, but it seems to be a systematic attempt to just destroy the American economy and many other, parts of our culture and society. So, but a lot of that, as I said, goes back to, having made this unfortunate choice to atomize all of American life along the highway strip and the suburban landscape. And it's really been, it's been a fiasco. But as I may have said to you before, my principal theory of history is that things happen because they seem like a good idea at the time. And that accounts for many of the choices that we made. And now it's not a good idea anymore. But we're stuck with all that infrastructure and that whole way of life. And, it's sucking all of the wealth out of our society just to run it. And it's driving us crazy in the process.
When you talk about the homeless crisis and how these are mentally ill people and they should be in the hospital, It's not as if these people had a choice. Doctors were paid by the pharmaceutical companies to create OxyContin addicts, 100,000 overdoses last year. So it's a genocide. That's not just a mentally ill person.
Well, that was the next step, Max. The first step was closing all the mental hospitals all over the United States.
Right, just like in California, just like in California, they closed, they tore down all the rail systems to introduce cars. Right, the corporations don't care. It's the Cyclone B of our times is essentially OxyContin, and the goal is extermination. That's pretty clear.
Well, I'm not sure that I would go that far down the intentional path with that. But, there are many things that we do or don't do that are just simply foolish. We very badly need to start thinking about reconstructing the railroad system in the U.S., and we refuse to do it, and it's just out of sheer stupidity and laziness.
Right. So let's return to the hellscape that we see in California, because California is always our future. We head west since the beginning of, the colonization of the Americas. And it's also where we have our high-tech industry and our propaganda, the Hollywood industry and stuff like that. So there's a quote from Frederick Bastiat whereby, he warned basically 150 years ago that when plunder becomes the way of life for men in society, that they would create the legal and moral structure to justify it. So in California, we seem to see that come true. We see the legal structure has been changed in order to justify the plunder. It's no longer, you're not even actually even allowed to call it looting. They said that's a harmful word to use against these people. So what do you
It makes the looters feel bad.
Yeah. So where does that go? Like, is this just the beginning of the very end of empire, whereby it's just full on looting, loot whatever you can, like as every end of any nation state, the corruption and the regime falls apart?
Well, it's one thing when the authorities can't help it, when they simply don't have the means to enforce it. It's another thing when they refuse to enforce it. And it's another thing when they, make ridiculous policy changes like decriminalizing crime, which is exactly what happened in California. So, the West Coast has just kind of gone insane. It may be arguably worse in Washington State and Oregon. Where in Oregon the governor there is completely insane. So where does that go? Well, my guess is that it'll go until people have had enough of it, and then there will be an intense and severe overreaction to all that. But where we are now is, it seems kind of hopeless and unfixable, but it can be fixed.
Yeah. So severe reaction to it. We've had 3 revolutions in the last 100 years or so: the Russian, the French, the American. In the United States, when you have looters are looting the looters, right? So this has become a socialist paradise, right? This is socialism. We know that every experimentation with socialism ends in societal collapse and some kind of massive change. So what will the American insurrection look like? Will it be like a Bolshevik revolution? Will it be like a French revolution with a reign of terror, perhaps? Or will it be more like a new American revolution? Those are the 3.
We're actually in the American Jacobin phase of what the French Revolution did. The Jacobins were that faction of the extreme left that came along in 1793 and tried to turn French culture upside down. They changed the number of days in the week, the number of months in the year, and all kinds of other modules of French culture that made people really nuts. And so after about 11 months of that, they threw them out, cut their heads off, and that was the end of it. So we're in the Jacobin phase now, where we're asked to believe ridiculous things that aren't true. Like, there are 117 sexes, and that looting is just fine. It's just another form of reparations for oppressed peoples. And, about 38 other things that are at odds with reality. So, People can only take so much unreality.
Well, let's follow up on that because while the term Orwellian is overused, in the US case, it seems to be the situation as George Orwell described what he saw in Europe in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. So the totalitarianism, whereby, such that we can't even say some of the words you've been saying. We can't say the C word. You can't talk about certain things on social media because you will be memory holed, literally. So where does that go? Because if you tune into the cable news and news, people are supposed to give some sort of description of what's happening in the economy and society and culture, but it's like a different reality. It's bonkers land. And what do you see? Where does this go?
What I see is that the regimes that are running the various parts of this racket are going to be they're going to be overthrown. You've got other things like the whole medical racketeering system, the university and higher ed racketeering system, the college loan system, the intellectual racketeering that's going on the campuses right now by just retailing ridiculous fields of study and idiotic ideas that are truly detrimental to society. And, you've got rackets everywhere. This has become kind of a racketeering country, by which I mean, making money by dishonest means any way possible.
Okay, yeah, Jacobin Uprising, great and fascinating stuff. Hey, let's take a break, and when we come back, let's head to the second half. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser with Stacy Herbert. This is our special holiday time when we talk to the bright minds, our guests from the years, and pick their brains for more insight with a treasure trove of great stuff. Anyway, James Howard Kunstler is with us. Now, James, we talk about the United States and we talk about it in aggregate for the most part. But of course, the United States is 50 states, and these states are autonomous to a large degree. And right now, we have refugees leaving California and New York, and they're going to places like Florida and Texas. America's had a history of civil war before. We could have another civil war around some new issues. But don't the states have the ability to, become more proactive in fighting what would you classify at the federal government level as outright tyranny?
I think that's self-evidently what's being worked out right now. It was one of the pillars of my book, The Long Emergency, that as this process progressed, we would see the federal government becoming increasingly ineffectual and impotent and unable to discharge its obligations. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing now, although with a great deal of sturm, drang, noise, and confusion. And the states of necessity are having to pick up policy decisions on their own to make some kind of coherent way of life in these places.
Right. Well, let's continue with that sort of theme because I like the whole positive outlook and the looking at some sort of optimistic horizon. Because I think in the first half, when we covered the pessimistic side, that sort of totalitarianism and pessimism and the mass looting and the fecal matter on the streets, I think that's kind of there's a positive thing in that system is ending. Like it's a sign of that system has not much longer to survive. So in terms of like a positive future, Max and I are Bitcoiners and we live amongst Bitcoiners and we have this notion of relentless optimism and building our own citadels and escaping from this sort of hellscape that we've been discussing. So you do see these moves on the state levels. You do see states, providing some sort of safe haven from the woke madness on the federal level. But with those refugees fleeing, the woke refugees fleeing woke states like California, I suppose there's a bit of a danger that they could bring that sort of the same things that destroyed their own home state to the neighboring states. But do you think, like, it feels like it's the end of the nation state era. I mean, it's only been around for like 100 years or so, 200 years. So could we be moving to a post nation state era?
Well, it was the idea in my long emergency book that we were actually going to see the, relocalization. We're going to see power devolve to lower levels, maybe even below the state level, because it's not clear that these gigantic state governments can manage things either. But we're going to see all kinds of movements and changes and swirling new dispositions of things. One of them is that we're going to get in tremendous trouble with the cities, as I've mentioned before in this show. The cities have attained a scale that simply can't be managed going into the future, and a lot of people in the meantime have moved to the suburbs, and that's been enabled by the whole work from home movement. But what they're going to discover was that that's not really where the action's going to be. The action's going to be moving to the smaller towns, the places that have been the most disinvested in the last 50 years, and the places that have some kind of a meaningful relationship with food production and with water transportation. Because, we're beginning to see the beginning of the end of the trucking industry. We're going to have to move more things on the American inland waterway system. So, all these places that have been devalued, like the central Midwest, the Great Lakes states, the places along the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi and Missouri system, these places may end up becoming much more valuable than we even imagine now. So those are the demographic movements. I disagree with you that, a whole lot of woke people are going to be moving to unwoke states. It seems to me that the woke are perfectly happy in their woke states, and they'll stay there until life there is no longer possible. But it's a very confusing picture right now because, as I said, people are moving to the suburbs, which is probably a mistake. The places that are the most suburban in construction, like the Sun Belt cities like Houston and Dallas and Orlando, all of those states, Atlanta. Those are the places that are going to become the most disorderly, I believe. And so, people are going to have to really think counterintuitively about where to go.
Hey, let's talk about some economics here. So Joe Biden and senior Democrats claim that they're going to investigate everyone from corporations to oil producers to find out why prices are rising. Do you have any tips for Biden on where to find the source of inflation, James?
Yeah, I have a tip for Joe Biden. Although I don't even know that he's receiving tips. He ought to look into just the basic philosophy of government recently, which is that you can print as much money as you feel like printing and just throw it out of helicopters to people, and that we'll just do fine. There is a relationship between money and true wealth, which is the production of things of value. And if you detach that from money, you're going to end up with money that is meaningless. And that's exactly what inflation is a process of doing. It is the rendering of money into meaninglessness. So we simply have a deranged government, and to some extent a deranged society that the government is trying to run. So how do we get out of this derangement is perhaps a larger issue. And it may require some kind of a social and political convulsion. I would just describe that as a period of serious disorder between where we are at now and our destination, which will be a society run at a much lower level of technocracy and complexity. And I think most of the bets right now are on higher complexity. And I think that would be a wrong bet.
That is really fascinating, to bet on simplicity instead. And, aside from the geography of nowhere, you've also wrote The Long Emergency and extensively about the carbon, oil, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
We saw Joe Biden in the same week, bizarrely, like attending the COP26 conference and berating all these, like, developing nations, saying they can't develop their own economy through carbon use. And at the same time, he was yelling at Saudi Arabia and Russia, OPEC plus, to pump more oil. And then a week or two later, he then released more from the strategic petroleum reserves. So where does the petrodollar is a reality, that they're not going to actually go through with any of these sort of highfalutin ideas about cutting carbon emissions, are they? Because then it cuts the dollar.
No, the whole climate change, carbon emission thing is just a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing. The fact of the matter is that advanced civilizations run on fossil fuels. And the other fact of the matter is it's getting harder and harder to find affordable fossil fuels, and that the whole infrastructure for getting it is becoming undermined by economics, including especially the shale oil system, which was built on 10 years of extraordinary debt. And now that they've demonstrated that they can't make any money producing shale oil, they can't get any new loans or generate new debt. And that means that shale oil production is going to go down. And, it will prove to have been a very brief blip in the history of, advanced culture. And so what we're really dealing with is the reality of having to move away from fossil fuels, whether we like it or not, or whether it's a good idea or not. It's just a fact of life, really, that we're not going to have access to as much cheap and affordable energy as we did in the 20th century and a little bit beyond. That's over. So what do we do now? Well, that's a very good question. A lot of people would like to just, create a whole new nuclear fleet of reactors and power generation. But the big problem with that is that we're also entering a period of capital scarcity. The capital is not going to be there to do that kind of a project. And it's not going to be there because so much of the capital that we now take for granted is actually a figment of the collective imagination. It's not really there. It represents things that are not real. It represents all kinds of collateralized nothingness and rehypothecated nothing. That is going to go up in a vapor. And when it does, I'm sorry to mix the metaphor, but as Warren Buffett said, when the tide goes out, we'll see who's swimming naked.
Right.
And,
looking at the economics here. So the military in America takes 50 cents of every tax dollar collected. It's this enormous multi-trillion-dollar behemoth. And it runs on energy. It's the biggest energy user in the United States and one of the biggest energy users in the world. But as you point out, the supply lines are breaking down and sourcing parts gets very difficult. So the inflation caused by all the money printing is breaking the supply lines. So you may find that the empire and the military behind it, the thing that Paul Krugman says is the backing for the US dollar, can collapse because they can't find a chip.
Yeah, and what you're describing are systems of complex systems of systems that are breaking down here and there, and each breakdown is ramifying and multiplying the breakdowns elsewhere. So they are kind of mutually cascading into general breakdown, and we can see that very clearly just in the last 6 months in the USA, where we can't even get the tools to make the parts to fix the things that we need to run our country. So this is happening very fast, and I mean, I see it every day around me with the car guy couldn't get me a brake line for my pickup truck. It's sitting down at the shop, and I'm not the only guy who's going through that right now. But imagine the professional truck drivers who can't make a living because they can't get their truck service.
Right. Sounds like the long emergency is over, and now we're just in the emergency. But anyway,
Well,
James Howard Kunstler, we got to say goodbye. Fascinating as always. Before Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald, there was James Howard Kunstler. Without him, there wouldn't be those other guys. Thanks for being on the show.
dang. You're welcome, and have a lovely Christmas.
All righty. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. Thank our guest, James Howard Kunstler, author of The Long Emergency and The Geography of Nowhere, and many, many more. Until next time, bye, y'all.